Have you ever heard the expression, you can tell by the handwriting on the wall? Do you know where that came from? Well, that's my lesson today, so you stay tuned and I'll tell you all about it. It all took place in Daniel chapter 5 in the Old Testament of your Bible. My lessons, we've been studying Daniel, his life. He has been asked to do some very strange things. Remember, he's a Jew, and he's in captivity, and he's in a foreign land. But he hasn't lost his faith in his God, even though they've taken him out of the country where he learned all about it. And because of that, he has asked his God to solve some very difficult messes. And those messes have all been affecting the ruler of a kingdom called Babylon. One of the messes was a dream that the monarch had involving a statue. And it didn't make any sense, but he told them what the sense was. Another mess was a dream involving cutting down a great big tree. I told you about that. Well, today's lesson, we're going to find that Daniel again has been called to clean up another mess. And it involves a ruler, but this time it's a new ruler. The old ruler, whom Daniel had been serving, is now dead. This ruler, his grandson, he took over, and he's been ruling in his stead now for many years. Well, let's pick up the story. In chapter 5, Daniel is the key figure in our story, along with this new ruler whose name is Belshazzar. He's the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, and he's now the ruler of the Babylonian Empire. And in today's lesson, you're going to find that this Babylonian rulership of the entire then known world is going to come to an end. Chapter 5 of Daniel is going to tell how it all met its demise. It's going to be the fall of that great nation. Daniel the prophet, he's going to show up right in the middle of all of this. And you're going to be quite surprised what he's been asked to do. Verse 1, chapter 5. Belshazzar, the king, had a party, and it was a great feast. Thousands were present, including over 1,000 nobles. And the wine flowed freely. They drank and drank and drank. You say, well, what's the celebration? Who was the party for? Remember the expression, pride goes before a fall? Well, arrogance is going to lead to Belshazzar's defeat. The city of Babylon, where this party is being held, was considered impregnable. So fortified as the city and the capital that it would never fall, never be defeated. And they had a good reason for their safety. The city had enough stored provisions to see them through several years of a siege. They also had magnificent fortifications in their walls. Some parts of the walls were over 100 feet high, and they were 85 feet wide. Well, with walls that thick, they were actually considered unassailable. Inside the walls, the city had 3,000 acres of land where the people lived in their houses. And outside of that, there was a large moat surrounding the walls. Some scholars, they estimated that the walls held at least 100 towers, giving the Babylonians, especially their military, great advantage to ward off any attack. Just north of the city, there was another Babylonian river by the name of the Tigris River. And it was there just a few days before this party. The Babylonian troops they ran into a small contingent of Medo-Persian army troops, and they defeated them. And they were so excited that they decided to throw this party to celebrate. So with that taste of victory still in their mouth, Belshazzar, he has this wonderful party. You can only imagine the size of the hall that would hold thousands and thousands of partygoers. Girls and ladies in their finest gowns. Nobles and military officers in their tuxedos and military uniforms. When the party and the celebration was well on its way, King Belshazzar, he got a great idea. Many years before, he had heard that his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar, when he had conquered Jerusalem, the Hebrew capital in Judah, it was there that he rounded up Daniel, just a young teen adolescent, and they brought him to Babylon as a captive fugitive. Well, that's not all they brought. Before he destroyed the temple, he stole all the precious gold and silver vessels used that the Jewish people used to worship in their celebrations. When they got back to Babylon, they were kept in safety in a Babylonian archives, and they've been there ever since. The king got an idea. He went and he asked the keeper of the springs to bring them out. So knowing that, these sacred vessels, they were brought into that party, and they were used at all the tables celebrating his gods. But in so doing, he defamed the Lord of Israel, and he exalted himself above the King of Kings. All the Babylonian rulers, their nobles, their wives, their concubines, they all joined him in that ridicule of Yahweh, Daniel's God, by drinking wine from the very vessels that the Jews had used to worship the God of heaven. These false gods, verse 3, they were better than Yahweh. Well, that did it. All the party festivities and the drunken atmosphere in that banquet is now going to come to a sudden end. Verse 5. The fingers of a man's hand began to emerge on the plaster of the wall behind Belshazzar's table, and it began writing opposite the lampstand. Belshazzar, he just stared at the back of this hand that did the writing. The Bible narrative goes on and says that as the drunken Belshazzar stared at the words and the handwriting, his face grew pale, his thoughts alarmed him, his hip joints went slack, and his knees began to knock together. What a terrifying scene. The orchestra stopped playing. Gasps of disbelief were heard all over the banquet hall. The dancing girls stood motionless. The waiters stood silent. All the banquet guests became fearful. Not able to stand the sight any longer, Belshazzar, the king, he calls for his attendants in waiting to summon in some of the conjurers and some of the diviners to come immediately and explain that phenomena that he's just seen on the side of the wall. That was a bit useless, however, because when they came and they looked at the writing, they couldn't break the code, nor could they interpret the handwriting that they saw. Sitting not far from Belshazzar's table was his mother. She was at the party. She was the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. she saw this writing, and she remembered that her father needed an interpretation long ago. And he summoned this Hebrew captive Daniel to come before him and explain to the letter the mystery. In panic, Belshazzar, he begins to start offering rewards. Anybody that can decode this meaning, he's going to give them prizes, and I mean big prizes. His mother's idea was passed on to him. Belshazzar heard it. Belshazzar, without hesitation, he yelled out Daniel's name. Servants gave instant obedience, and they quickly rushed out to find this 80-year-old prophet of Judah. The queen's mother describing Daniel was the last thing that the king needed to hear. Do you know what she said? If you bring this man into this party to interpret what you've just seen on that wall, you're going to find he has an extraordinary spirit. He has knowledge beyond anyone else's. And you're going to see that he has insight enough to tell you what went on. Well, if anybody can interpret and explain, it was that man. Imagine an old 80-year-old possessing yet a godly life, untainted by the heathen culture that he's been living in Babylon. Can you still be counted on to keep your faith when nobody else can? Do you know God still asks you to do that? He doesn't want you to give it up because of your age. Verse 13. This king spoke, and he said to Daniel when Daniel arrived, "Are you the Daniel who was one of the exiles from Judah, whom my grandfather, the king, brought from that land?" Daniel paused, and he looked at the king, and he quietly said, "Yes, I'm the one." Belshazzar, without hesitation, he said, "Well, if you can read the inscription and make the interpretation known to me, I'm going to clothe you with purple. I'm going to put around your neck a golden chain, and I'm going to make you the third ruler of the authority in the whole kingdom of Babylon." Daniel quietly stared at the man, and he said, "Your Honor, I don't need your gifts. You keep them. Give them to somebody else. But I'll read the inscription that the king has asked me to do, and I'm going to make the interpretation known unto him." But before he does, he gives a little review of the behavior of his grandfather, the former Babylonian ruler. He tells Belshazzar his grandfather was a man who was very proud, very arrogant, and that behavior cost him his throne, and his glory was taken away from him. Having told him all those events, he now gives some very biting words to Belshazzar. "You, Your Majesty, are no better than he was. You're just as bad. And you, like him, you've exalted yourself above the Lord of heaven. And you brought the vessels of his house out of storage into your party. You drank from them. And all your party goers, they drank from them, and they bragged and they praised your gods. And your gods that you have are gold, they're silver, they're bronze. But guess what? Your gods can't hear. Your gods don't see. And your gods don't understand. Mine does. But the God in whose hand I represent, he's the guy that gives you breath. And you ignored it. That God whom you ticked off, he was the handwriting there on the plaster, on the wall. And I'm going to tell you the inscription. But you're not going to like what I'm going to tell you. The mysterious inscription on that plaster is God's judgment. And you, Belshazzar, are a complete, proud show-off. You're a prideful Babylonian idolater. I think Belshazzar, when he watched that single hand do its writing, I think he knew. And I think he feared what was coming. Don't you find it strange? Often our wicked behavior, it announces within us something bad is on the way even before it happens. Have you ever noticed that? Well, Daniel didn't mince words. He looked at Belshazzar the king right in the eye and he said, verse 25, Mene, mene, tekel upharsin. You have no hours left in your life. God has weighed you on his scales. Your kingdom is going to be taken away from you tonight. And it's going to be taken away by your enemy, those Medes and Persians. But, Your Majesty, tonight you're going to die. Belshazzar gave Daniel everything that he promised, even after he said that. He gave him a promotion, even though the promotion was empty, because that night he was slain. Darius the Mede, he took over the kingdom. Typhoid fever is a very frightening disease. And it was discovered by a French microbiologist named Louis Pasteur. He discovered the principle of vaccination at the same time. And he pioneered the idea that diseases could be stopped by simply killing the germ. Are you familiar with the term pasteurization? Well, that's where it came from. They named it after him. Drinking water and milk 200 years ago were contaminated with bacteria, and that caused a very deathly illness. One was typhoid fever. A patient would suffer sharp abdominal pain. He'd become listless. He'd get confused. He'd lose weight. And then he would die. And he would often do this within 6 months, often even 6 weeks. Treating patients with those symptoms, Pasteur, he discovered typhoid fever. But he paid a high price for it. He lost 3 of his 5 children to typhoid fever. That was because there was something about that typhoid germ that he didn't know. You could be a carrier of the disease, and you don't even know it. He infected his kids simply by showing up at home, coming home from his laboratory. And he wasn't aware that he was infecting his kids, even though he was a witting vector. Doctors today, they call that asymptomatic. You're a carrier of the germ even though you're not infected. Well, that's been proven among us today in the pandemic of the COVID, because people, they spread it because they don't have symptoms, but they're the carrier. Typhoid fever is a highly infectious disease. Pasteur did his job, he discovered it, but he paid a very, very high price for his work. Here's an example of how innocently you can make somebody sick simply by being a carrier of the germ. And it doesn't affect you, but you make them sick because you're infected and you don't know it. Mary Mallon, she was a young Irish immigrant from New York. And in the early years of the 20th century, in her young adulthood, she was hired and she worked for a number of well-to-do households in New York City. And she was hired as a cook, and she was also hired along as a housekeeper. But wherever she went, two things happened. All the time. People came down with typhoid fever, and Mary abruptly disappeared. In 1907, after a particularly bad outbreak, she was tracked down and she was also tested. Guess what? In that process, Mary Mallon became the first person to be confirmed as an asymptomatic carrier of a disease. Meaning, she was infectious but had no symptoms herself. People were so afraid of her when this was discovered that she was put in protective custody against her will, and she was locked up for 3 years. When she was released, she promised never again to take a job handling food. But in 1915, 25 people developed typhoid fever in the Sloan Hospital for Women in Manhattan. Mary Mallon was the cook, but she was the cook under a new assumed name. 2 of the victims died. Mary fled, but she was recaptured, and she spent the remaining 23 years of her life under house arrest until her death in 1938, the outbreak of the Second World War. No one knows how many deaths she caused and how many people she infected. None of this would have happened now that we know what that infection was as we look back. All she had to do was wash her hands before she handled food. Belshazzar, the king of Babylon, he didn't wash his hands. His wickedness allowed him to continue for several years, handing out all kinds of infection before God brought it to an end. And out of his grace, he gave Belshazzar every opportunity to turn from his idolatry and his wicked gods and commit his life to the Lord. He refused. He didn't wash his hands. He set himself up higher than God did. God said, "That's enough." And he was killed. But you notice how many other people he infected because he didn't wash his hands? Louis Pasteur, highly respected for his work with typhoid fever. Daniel, the prophet, highly respected for his reputation by keeping his eyes on his God. Never underestimate, class, the power of one godly life. In a climate of idolatry, in a climate of immorality, in a climate of treason, Daniel confronted a pagan empire, and God is still looking for Daniels. And he's looking for them today, and he's looking for them in you. If you're his prophet, do you know what he wants you to do? He wants you to serve him regardless of the pressure. Are you prepared to be his spokesman? Are you prepared to look someone in the eye and say, "Look, it's time to wash your hands. It's time for you to take a look at why this disease is spreading"? When you come back next week, there's a wonderful story coming in this book of Daniel that I don't want you to miss. So please show up. I'm going to look for you to come back.